Hey friends, if you're new to the channel, I'm Tirso and I'm a creative director based in New York City. I'm continuing the graphic design principles series. We've already covered balance. In this video, we're going to talk about contrast. Contrast makes your designs more dynamic, and it also showcases that your designs are purposeful. It doesn't only need to apply to layout, it can also be applied to photographs, which you'll see in the examples. The greater the contrast, the greater the potential. You can create contrast through size, shape, color, and typography. I created a guide for you to reference in the description below. There's also some project files if you want to work on some layouts of your own. And if you want feedback, send them to hello@tirsogamboa.com. Size contrast or scale contrast is simply when you put a large element next to a smaller one. It creates a hierarchy of importance in your designs, and you can use it in both type and image. So let's put that into context. We have a layout. It's asymmetrically balanced for those of you who watched the previous video. It definitely works as a design solution, but we can improve the layout by implementing size contrast. The top photo is technically bigger than the bottom. Here's an overlay so you can see a true comparison. When it comes to contrast, you want it to be more visually noticeable, so let's adjust this. The hero should be significantly larger. The image was dark enough to have the headline read on the photo. This is something you can do to save space on your layouts. The bottom image can now get much smaller to fit in the space, and then the text. Let's go back to the original layout. The white space is really nice here. It gives the page some breathing room. If we wanted to maintain that, we simply have to contain the images in this area that we've already allocated for them. Again, we make the hero image larger, adjust the secondary photo, but now we have an empty pocket. We can do two things here. This photo is conveniently a horizontal image, so we can extend to fill some of that space, or we can simply add another photo that's even smaller to further emphasize contrast. Here's a layout I worked on in a previous video. Clean, it's structured, so how do we add contrast? Size contrast can be applied to any element on your design. In this case, we can apply it to the strokes. Currently, they're all the same weight. The system I decided on was to have the horizontal lines thicker. This isn't completely necessary, but micro design matters. For me, I think this is a nice touch that makes the layout a little bit bolder. What if you don't want the lines at all? Because of the alignment, this layout is still easily read. The two largest images here are cocktail cans and the knife. We can call them out more through contrast by adding boxes around them like this. I mentioned that size contrast can be implemented to any design element. Let's look at this example. First, just a shout out to Horatia Rojas on the photography, which I grabbed from free stock. The images here are both the same size. The simplest solution is to make one of the photos smaller. So yes, we have contrast. However, this is a photo shoot, and if you watch my videos on producing a shoot, there's so much work that goes into it, so we do actually want the images to be as big as possible. Let's take a different approach here. We're talking about size contrast, so technically one should be smaller than the other. We can do this by adding a border. Now let's look at the photographs themselves. Our model is roughly the same size. He's also sitting and holding a camera in both photos. How you can add contrast here is by using a photo that's more zoomed in. Now we have contrast between the size of the photos, and we also have a difference in scale from the size of our model within those crops. Shape contrast is using different shapes to call out certain elements of your design. Blocks of text are naturally rectangular, so to make an element stand out, maybe use a circle or even an arrow. Here's a layout about coffee. Let's first start by adjusting the scale contrast on the page. The hero image gets larger, we adjust the text on the left, and then we adjust the images on the bottom. I just want to adjust the styling on this headline real quick. The crop on this coffee isn't great. This image would feel much better as a square. Okay, so very similar layout to what we did in the first example. The layout is fine, but we're talking about shape contrast here. Let's start with the headline. I have this border around it. Everything on the page is pretty blocky. We can try a circle, which would balance out the circle on the bottom right. This can work, but let's go back to the original box. We can approach this more delicately by simply rounding out the corners of the box. I'm showing this because I want you to see that you can control how much contrast you add to things. So there's no overlap on this layout. We can create a touch of dimension to this rounded rectangle by adding a shadow to it. Here I'm using a shape to create that effect. Notice also that the shadow is slightly thicker than the rule of the box for more contrast. Now, can you think of another way we can create shape contrast on this layout? I'll give 10 seconds here, feel free to pause. The coffee cup on the bottom right is sitting on a wood background. There aren't really any other props in the photo, so we can use a silhouette of the coffee cup instead. This is a very common editorial design convention. It creates more white space in this corner, which balances out some of the white space on the left side. Because of the shadow, it creates dimension on the page. There was a spoon in the original photo of the coffee cup, so we can just add a silhouette of a spoon and we're done. The overlap and shadows in this bottom right really help the page become more interesting. Last example for shape contrast, this is a layout I put together from my trip to Switzerland. The scale contrast is pretty subtle across the spread, but it still feels balanced to me. If you wanted to push this a little bit more, we can add some dimension to a few of the images like this. To add shape contrast, we simply rotate them to change the shape. Not necessary at all, I actually prefer the original layout, but I wanted to show you another way to create shape contrast. Color contrast is interesting because color is so complex. Color allows you to control how much contrast you want, monochromes provide a more subtle approach to contrast, and on top of that, color really affects the mood of your designs. I do have one comment on color. We've heard that opposites attract, but I highly discourage this when it comes to color. I very rarely use complementary colors in my designs. If you don't know what complementary colors are, they're just opposite colors on the color wheel. It doesn't matter what you do with complementary colors, there's often a sports team associated with them. Orange and blue, this is the Chicago Bears, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where I went to school. I'm in New York, and it's also the palette for the New York Knicks. Yellow and purple, that's definitely the Lakers. Green and red, no sports team comes to mind, but if you're using green and red, you're creating a nightmare for people who are colorblind. My last note about complementary colors is that they're basic. When you're designing things, you want to showcase your abilities, and I find that complementary colors show a limited knowledge of design. That's my little diatribe, now onto some layouts. Let's go back to some of the layouts we just worked on. Earlier, we approached the spread through size contrast. We can also approach it through color contrast. We can remove the border and then simply turn one of the images in black and white. Lastly, the contrast on the caption could be increased. I'll switch it to white, and this is done. Here's a comparison of the two options. On the left, we approached it with size contrast. On the right, we approached it with color contrast. For this layout, I purposely left this box surrounding the title empty so we can fill it in now. I'm going with a muted blue. In particular, when working with type, we need to make sure the contrast is strong. This would definitely fail usability standards on web and mobile, so let's increase the readability by making the text darker and the background lighter. This is not a real cover, it's also not a real magazine, but I made it for example. Contrast is really strong here, but perhaps it could use some color. I added pops of color in the headlines, and I've also reduced how bright the logo was. Let's try another colorway. This time I'll change the background color. Since our model is in grayscale, I want to keep this pretty monochrome, so I'll stay in the yellow family. In this instance, I also shifted the logo to more of a tan, which feels more elegant to me. And here are those three covers. Color really controls the mood of your design, so learn how to master it. You cannot call yourself a graphic designer unless you know typography. Contrast in typography is your best friend when it comes to organizing information. What's also great about it is that you can apply all the previous contrast to it. This is a photo I took from the camp exhibit at the Met. There's a lot of white space in this spread, which we should all love as designers, but let's add some contrast. The first way to add contrast to your type is through size, which we can already see here with the size of the headline versus the size of the deck. The second way is to do it through font weight. Within the title, I'm using light and bold weights here. Always remember to skip at least one weight when doing this. We can increase scale by going to the end of the margin. Since we got bigger, we can go thinner. Let's actually go big or go home. We added contrast through a thick-thin earlier, but when it comes to font weight, don't forget that italics are also an option. I think this can go even thinner. The deck placement isn't working anymore, so we can move that down to align with the body copy, and then add contrast here as well by going bolder. In the body copy, we can do a lead and stylen or a drop cap. Let's try a drop cap for scale contrast. This M is in the same typeface as the headline, but we're trying to create contrast here, so let's actually pair it with the typeface from the deck. Final touch is adding our color contrast like this. It's a slightly darker red than the photo, but it pairs nicely. It was hard to show shape contrast in the last example, so I tried to make it happen here. It's a very busy image, but we're trying to fit the recipe name somewhere. We can put our text in a shape. A circle is always a great option, however, there's so many circles already in the photos, so we can add contrast by changing the shape. I opted for a hexagon. It feels much better with the hexagon pointing upwards versus lying flat. We can inset this shape within the photograph through an overlap like this. Then let's add some color. I'm using a yellow here because of the egg and the yeast package. We can also further separate the shape from the background through color contrast. I added a border to it and we're done. So that is contrast in the context of graphic design. Use it often and use it well. Don't forget to download the guide as well as the project files. If you have any questions, comment below. Support the channel by subscribing, and I'll see you next time.